All right, so you've gone through, you've talked about the last 7-8 minutes, you talked with your group. You guys have shared that most of you have talked about initiating a naval blockade. The others are talking about conventional airstrikes. So, the conventional airstrikes are good. However, what happens, how do we airstrike them but not set off the missiles? That might be a concern, that might be a negative. I know there was a couple groups that came up with that. All right, so most of you talked about the naval blockade. Hold it down. Hey, you're like literally like 2 feet away. Now, all right, here's what happened. So, in the early discussions for the XCOM meetings, which is again the president's advisors, they dominated the conversation with the desire for airstrikes. Now, if you look, these are some of the closest advisors. Now, I know this picture's a little bit fuzzy, but if you look here, what do those guys look like? Sam, what do they look like? See the little metals and brass and stuff that's on there? What do you think?
I don't know.
Ed, these guys here, what do they look like that are talking to the president here?
They look like they're really high up in power.
What kind of power? In what?
Military.
In military, right? They look like Army. That's totally, they look like Army and the Navy. So these are the guys that are doing the advising. So they're saying airstrikes. Let's do it with the military. But the president was not convinced of that. So in the end, what the president did choose was a blockade. He thought that was the best choice. Now the advisors thought the other option, the rest of the options were either too risky. Tati, enough out of you. They ruled that the airstrikes were out. They were out. They were too risky. They were too rash. Basically, it was the blockade was the best idea that they had without really initiating any type of that would initiate a military response from the Soviet Union or from Cuba. Okay. Here's the other thing. If we did do airstrikes and we did kill Soviet troops, good chance we're going to bring in the Soviets in, which is the last thing we want to do at this point. And the other thing about Kennedy is that you understand he is Catholic. So he's got a morality, the morality of who he is. There's guilt that's associated with being Catholic. Now, I know there's some Catholics out there that understand. My stepdad was a Catholic, or is a Catholic, and I grew up with this. So I understand that. But that becomes a part of morality and who you are. He didn't want to strike first. He didn't want to be the guy that started the war. And that also was one of the reasons why he went with the blockade. Plus, it gave Khrushchev, all right, the leader of the Soviet Union, time to think about the response to the blockade. He didn't have to make a quick, rash decision. So, the blockade is what they went with. All right, so let's look at the third here. This is a map of the naval blockade. You can kind of see that's around Cuba. It was set up around 500 miles off the coast of Cuba in international waters. So they weren't, even though this shows like they're right up against it, they were further out, 500 miles. Okay. Now, here's where we're going to get to. You got your document C. All right, and this top briefing C this is to the committee members and it's from the president. And this is it's the response and the Soviet reactions. So now your groups now are part of the XCOM team. You're going to respond to 4 situations that the president might face. You're going to offer a recommendation. So there are 4 of them. What should the president do? And this is what you're responding to. What should the president do if the Soviets fire on the naval vessels enforcing the blockade? What should the president do if the Soviets attempt to break the blockade? What should the president do if the Soviets wait it out for weeks and months until the crisis just goes away? And the last one is, what should the president do if the Cuban commanders launch one of the missile sites already in Cuba towards the United States? So I want you to discuss that amongst your group. I want you to come up with those those ideas, and then we'll come back and discuss that.